Owen, thanks for joining us. Whereabouts in the country are you? I know we're all doing this virtually via Zoom, so it's nice to give people a bit of background on where you are.
North London because I'm a plastic Mancunian who sold out my northern roots. Still staying in the north though.
Yeah, Dan's a big fan of Manchester.
I am a big fan. I lived there for many years. But
where are you from, Dan, originally?
I'm originally from a little town called Cannock. Which you may have campaigned in. It was a Labour seat for many years under Tony Wright.
Oh yeah,
who was a really independent sort of independent-minded MP who kind of did his own thing. And Labour incorrectly in 2010, when he stood down, interpreted the seat as a strong Labour seat, when in fact it was actually a pretty right-wing Labour seat that Tony Wright did quite a good job of hanging on to. Yeah. And then Aidan Burley rocked up. Aidan Burley, one-term MP, famous for a few embarrassing moments, and took the seat. So there you go.
And where's it? Shehab? Are you a Southerner?
I am. I'm from London, and I think my current MP is Sam Tarry, who is a Corbynite. Helped Corbyn to run his campaign a long time ago.
Yeah, I've known him for 15 years, Sam.
My MP used to be Mike Gapes, who actually left to the Labour Party to join Change UK, which I'm sure we'll have a quick discussion about at some point in the midst of our conversation.
This should be a podcast. Who's your MP?
Who's your MP and why?
Great.
So before we get into the details of what happened with Change UK and all the interesting bits that have happened over the last few years, the first question, I know you've got a book out and we will get onto that soon. The first question I wanted to ask you is, we've got a new Labour leader, Keir Starmer. He did his first sort of big speech at this virtual party conference. It was a bit different for a new Labour leader to come out and not really mention his predecessor. There wasn't much talk about what Jeremy Corbyn had done and hadn't done. Instead, Sir Keir tried to distance himself as much as possible from the previous Labour leader's record. What did you make of that? Did you think that was a good idea?
Well, I think it's kind of inevitable after a massive defeat, which the Labour Party obviously suffered last December, that you'd want some sort of demarcation. I mean, I suppose the question is, because I suppose the Keir Starmer project isn't clearly defined yet, what it actually is. In the leadership election, he stood on 10 pledges, and those 10 pledges were basically to defend a lot of the domestic policies, I suppose, which were associated with the last few years. That's increasing taxes on top earners and corporations, big businesses, scrapping tuition fees, the green industrial revolution, no illegal foreign wars, common ownership, which I suppose needs to be fleshed out, of utilities. So, he didn't in that speech abandon those. What I suppose his team believe and are very conscious of is a sense that for a lot of those in the so-called red wall, those seats obviously which Labour lost in often smaller towns in the north and the Midlands, post-industrial, felt that the last Corbyn leadership was bad on national security and on patriotism, and that was the pitch obviously he was trying to go for. It's interesting because some people kicked off on the left over Starmer talking about patriotism, but actually, weirdly, they're not that well noted. Corbyn did a speech on patriotism a few days before the general election in 2019. And I suppose the issue, though, is, in terms of the debate that will come about how you win back those voters, which is what Keir Starmer was pitching at. He was pitching at those voters, particularly in those towns in the north, was a lot of them voted to leave the European Union. And I suppose Keir Starmer feels he has to lean in heavier onto that terrain because he's very associated with the Remain project. What he's done, and we can see this with the trap which was set by Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, which was, we're going to flout international law. The whole point of that was to trip Labour into saying, this is absolutely outrageous, we're going to kick off, so that they could try and again portray Labour as trying to, overturn the referendum result, destabilise it, open up old wounds, even though that's what the Tories are doing. I just wish Labour had stuck to that earlier, because obviously that under the Corbyn leadership, when they tried to accept the referendum result, a lot of the people now cheering on Keir Starmer for saying that's a genius political tactic were the ones denouncing Jeremy Corbyn at the same time for going along with Brexit, being the midwife for Brexit and not providing opposition. So I think that's interesting.
There's an argument on the left that if you try and fight the Conservative Party on their own territory, so if you try and fight them on patriotism and all those things that Keir Starmer tried to kind of almost reintroduce to the Labour membership at that conference speech, then you'll lose. If you try and fight them on that territory, you'll lose. You're kind of walking straight into a trap, and that's exactly what the Tories want you to do. Do you share that view, or do you think there is a sense, actually, that in Labour heartlands, the party is now seen, as a result of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, as unpatriotic, that they don't see the Labour Party as representing them anymore at all, and actually Keir Starmer has an enormous job in his hands to try and say, look, you can be a supporter of the Labour Party and actually be proud to be British?
On patriotism, it's how you define patriotism. I mean, patriotism for me means, what's more patriotic than wanting to rid your country of injustice? I think Labour should make that issue. What's more patriotic than wanting to make sure that every single citizen in a wealthy nation has a decent, affordable home in which they live, a secure, well-paid job, where the wealth that is created through the hard graft and effort of millions of people doesn't end up in the pay packets of wealthy individuals who might back a Conservative Party that wraps themselves in the flag as they send that wealth off to offshore tax havens to keep it away from the British taxman. I think Labour could make that patriotic message. I think they could say as well, look at a history of people who struggled against injustice, whether it be, the Chartists, the world's first great working class political movement in the 19th century, fought for democracy, the suffragettes who fought for the rights of women to have a vote, whether it be those who fought for the welfare state, the National Health Service, those who fought racism, sexism, homophobia, who at the time were demonised, spat at in the streets and locked up in prisons. That is patriotic. You can make that patriotic message. I don't think patriotism, and I don't think millions of people think this, has to be this chauvinistic kind of empire and kind of a sense of that national superiority. It should be pride in the things that people fought for. I don't have a problem talking about patriotism. I don't think lots of people on the left have a problem talking about patriotism. I think people have a problem with how it can be framed. But I think it's, for me, though, the issue is, do I think it would be great if Labour went into the next general election and its offer is waving the Union flag and the Union Jack and that's its centrepiece? Clearly not. And I think actually what it should be focusing upon, though it can talk about these issues, I think with quite a lot of passion, but I think it should obviously focus on the fact that millions of people don't have affordable homes and what it's going to do about it. What it's going to do about the fact that most people in poverty are in work, earning their poverty. What's it going to do about the key workers we all just applauded, including in the Red Wall, who are undervalued and underpaid. So obviously it needs to the welfare state, the self-employed and gig economy workers who we can see in primary colours through this crisis, how badly treated and insecure they are. So obviously I think, you can't, the Union Jack is not going to feed a family. And the fact is millions of people in this country are denied security and freedom because if you're insecure and you're poor, you are not free. And I think Labour needs to have convincing answers to that. So sure, let's have a debate and conversation about patriotism. I don't know how many columns I've written about patriotism, but I don't think most people at the end of the day expect politicians to have answers to their everyday problems and their everyday struggles. I think columnists love a good debate about what is British and English identity. For me, it's going abroad and kicking myself not bringing a bag of PG tips and getting slightly annoyed about people not abiding by a queuing system. But we all have a different interpretation of what our identity is. But I think the centre point of the debate of politics should always be, what are the answers to the big problems and injustices that people face, who Labour was founded to represent? So it's not either or, in my opinion. I don't have a problem with Starmer's team talking about it as long as they're answering the other things.
Correct me if I'm mistaken, but one of your complaints is that Jeremy Corbyn did talk about patriotism. He spoke about a number of things and that he didn't get the right sort of coverage in the media that you would have liked to have seen. In your book, you talk about the backroom staff that worked for Jeremy Corbyn, the people whose job it is to make sure that press releases go out, that rebuttals go out, that when there are issues with things that the Prime Minister has said or those who are opposing Jeremy Corbyn say, that they actually respond to them to make sure that you get the sort of coverage that you think that Jeremy Corbyn didn't get. From your insight, I've read passages of your book in which there are certain people that you think quite frankly, didn't do the job they were supposed to do. Can you give us an insight into what was going on there? Why was that not happening? Why were people like Seamus Milne, who you mentioned in your book, taking so long to do these things? And ultimately, are they to blame? Because you seem to think that Jeremy Corbyn was making these necessary points about patriotism, responding to things accurately. People in the public didn't think so. I mean, that's why the election result didn't go the way you wanted it to. So what happened behind the scenes? You've spoken to many people when writing your book. Give us an insight.
Yeah, I mean, I basically interviewed the whole operation, and the starting point of my book was two things really. It was to look in great detail about what they were up against. It's an objective fact. I know people, roll their eyes and think go and bark at some thunder, but that overwhelmingly the British media in this country was very, very hostile and didn't just regard the Labour leadership as wrong, but actually as dangerous and illegitimate. That's just a fact. And at the same time, no leader of the opposition has faced such hostility from within their own party, whether it be the Parliamentary Labour Party or the machine. It's also true that because the left of the form which ran the Labour Party for a few years had been exiled for so long and been in the wilderness, there was very few people with the experience, management, administration, working with the media. And what happened was they were catapulted into what was, let's face it, the most tumultuous period in British politics since the war, which even the most experienced people would have struggled with. And the fact is, the reason I wrote this book was to say they were up against a formidable obstacles, but they also made a lot of mistakes. And unless you accept that, you adopt a fatalistic conclusion that this sort of transformative political project is always doomed. And it is absolutely the case that the operation was often deeply, deeply dysfunctional. It didn't, people, in a sense, there wasn't often quick responses. There weren't, quickly crafted, coherent responses to things. People whose job it was to do that were often missing in action. The press team were often tearing their hair out. Yeah, there was often a lack of direction.
Who do you think is to blame for that? Because interestingly, parts of your book seem to imply that maybe Jeremy Corbyn lacked the leadership to make sure that his backroom staff were working in the right way, and that at times he was missing from action, and that when it came to these big moments where big decisions needed to be made, his personality meant that he wasn't really the right person to do it. And when you reflect back on it, is that something that you would say is a fair assumption for us to be making?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the greatest strength of Jeremy Corbyn was his most fatal weakness, which is his aversion to conflict. The reason he got on the ballot paper in the first place is because he didn't really have any enemies at the time. He certainly does now within the Parliamentary Labour Party. John McDonnell was regarded by most Labour MPs as cantankerous, as sectarian, as rude, and all those things. I know that because I worked for John McDonnell for 3 years and tried to get him on the ballot paper twice. In the case of Jeremy Corbyn, it was I remember in 2007, Tom Watson had one of the first MPs to have a blog, and it was when Claire Short resigned the whip. Claire Short, of course, formerly in Tony Blair's cabinet as International Development Secretary, and he said, "Why doesn't John McDonnell have the courage of my friend Claire Short's convictions and resign the whip? And why have the Labour left put John McDonnell up for the leadership, which is what we did in 2007, rather than someone like Jeremy Corbyn, because at least Jeremy Corbyn is likeable?" So I'm sure he used those words, but that is interesting. That's what he wrote, and it's true. And the reason people liked Jeremy Corbyn in the 2017 election, he previously had a negative view during the campaign, was because the attempts to to pin dangerous demagogue extremist on him by the Tories and the press didn't really work, because people saw him on TV as this affable, nice, friendly, very undemagogic type of guy. But that's because he's averse to conflict. He doesn't like conflict. So what happens within the party?
Would you say he's not a natural leader, Owen? Basically, he's just not. He's just not a leader.
He didn't have conventional skills associated with leadership, because of course he was someone in exile on the backbenches for over 3 decades and hadn't run anything, and then he was parachuted into this position. He didn't stand for the leadership to become leader. He stood in order to beat Liz Kendall and get 20% of the vote and shift the terms of debate. And he won because his opponents didn't have any ideas. They lost because they didn't inspire anybody, and his ideas did. But what happened was, if you one of the things about being a leader is you've got to take tough decisions. Why are decisions tough? Because they require conflict. So when it got to the point where the country polarised over Brexit, which was fatal to the sort of politics Corbyn pursued, which was about, do you remember 2017, for the many, not the few? The majority have different economic interests than those at the top, and we need to redistribute wealth and power from those at the top to the majority. But suddenly we were all Remainers and Leavers, and that cut across class lines. And what happened is, as Remainers, particularly within the membership and within Labour's electoral base, got angrier because the Remain campaigns didn't win Leavers over, they just made existing Remainers more angry. That opened up a conflict within the parliamentary Labour Party, including good faith actors who just didn't like Brexit and bad faith actors who didn't like Brexit but saw it as a wedge issue to undermine the leadership. But equally within his own operation, they divided, and he was not able to bridge that conflict. And instead, and it was the same over things like anti-Semitism, he would go missing in action. And that's to do with his very nature. He doesn't like conflict. He's averse to conflict. And what happened by 2019 is his leadership team had fatally fractured. The unity and solidarity which prevailed in the 2017 election collapsed. The operation was dysfunctional by 2019 because they did not agree with each other, particularly on Brexit. And he wasn't able as a leader to bring that gap and divide together. And as a consequence, you saw an ever more dysfunctional operation, and that culminated in the disastrous election campaign of 2019, of course.
Keeping the party united is obviously a huge challenge for any Labour leader, especially when you've got so many different unions that have different beliefs. You've got different wings of the party, some of whom have very, very different views on the way in which the country and the party should be run. It takes one look through social media now to see people who had followed and supported Jeremy Corbyn being very critical of Keir Starmer. Some unions have done the same. You say that Jeremy Corbyn struggled with conflict and sort of keeping the party together because he had to make big decisions. This is going to be a challenge for Keir Starmer as well. He's going to have to somehow unite the party. He's going to have to deal with unions who may not always agree with him. What do you think he should be doing? Because at the moment, it appears that he's distancing himself from the left of the party. Do you think he should be encouraging the left of the party to sort of work with him? What would you like to see him do over the next few weeks, months and years?
So there's a drill going on, so apologies for that, but I will persevere.
We're drilling down into the detail, Owen. It's a
drilling
metaphor.
exactly. Let's use it as a crude brass eye type metaphor.
Drilling down.
Yeah, drilling down into. Well, what I would like Keir Starmer to do is stand by the 10 pledges he made during the leadership election on increasing taxes on the rich and big corporations to invest in the economy, the green industrial revolution, because there's this climate emergency, which this whole coronavirus crisis should be seen as a warm-up towards. Common ownership, he needs to define that. Scrapping tuition fees, we're seeing obviously at the moment lots of young people who saddled with debt who are very angry because they're not getting taught in person and so on. Yeah, I mean, what he needs to do, I think, I don't think the reason Labour lost the last general election was because people thought, oh, I really like my privatised railway system, it's brilliant. I didn't think they thought, oh, rich people are so hard done by. I just don't think they should be paying any more tax in this country. And I don't think they thought, well, actually, I do think we should saddle young people with debt if they dare to dream to a university education from which all society benefits. I don't think that happened. So I think the other thing is, what I would say is, if he departs from those promises, the danger he has is, it's very easy it's very hard in politics to establish a reputation for honesty and for saying what you mean and meaning what you say. But it's very easy to lose it. And actually, that's what partly trashed Jeremy Corbyn, because in 2017, he was seen as the man of principle. You might not agree with him, but he says what he means and he means what he says. And because Labour spent 2.5 years zigzagging over Brexit as their coalition fragmented and the Remain campaign succeeded in dragging them towards a second referendum position, he lost that. And actually, people just thought he was weak and indecisive and speaking out of both sides of his mouth. I think there's a lesson to be learned from that, which I think the new leadership, needs to be very wary of, because those promises, those commitments were made to the electorate in order to win the leadership. And it would look cynical if they were discarded. And I think, the leadership at the moment are very clear that those 10 pledges do remain. But there are siren voices within the Labour Party, including within the shadow cabinet, who want Keir Starmer to abandon those promises. So I think the position of the left now needs to be I joined the Labour Party myself when Tony Blair was leader. I was 15 years old. So, is to wish the Labour Party well, whilst building pressure both within the party or from with extra parliamentary movements, because we're seeing at the moment Black Lives Matter, the climate justice movement, private tenants organising, to put pressure on the Labour leadership to have a transformative agenda. And I would say the precedent could be Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee replaced George Lansbury in the 1930s, who was seen as a pacifist, slightly otherworldly leader without conventional leadership skills. Clement Attlee was a barrister from the middle of the party, no left-wing radical, and there was a national emergency, in that case the war, and Labour in that war said, well, when we win the war, we need to win the peace, and that needs not going back to how things were, but a transformative agenda. So I think Keir Starmer definitely obviously needs to learn the big, big mistakes that Labour made, but I don't think it's to do with saying, well, actually, we're going to stick with the privatised railway system and not expect rich people to pay more tax. And the danger is Rishi Sunak and the Tories, they're already talking about increasing corporation tax. They're talking about raising capital gains tax. You know, it would be tragic if the Labour Party ended up out-lefted by the Conservatives on economic policy, and I think they need to make sure they don't.
I was speaking to a senior member of Keir Starmer's team when I mentioned we were going to be speaking to you on this podcast. And they say their view is that you and kind of others like you on the left actually do want Keir Starmer to fail. That actually, if they win the election, if they prove a success, it just shows that the Corbyn project was a failure, that you were wrong, and actually it kind of puts you into the political wilderness for another sort of 20 or 30 years. Are they right?
I mean, in terms of how wrong they could be, they couldn't be any more wrong. I mean, I campaigned for Labour, as I've said, when Tony Blair was leader of the Labour Party. I grew up with people who grew up in overcrowded homes, whose parents worked in supermarkets on poverty wages, who wore school uniforms at weekends because they didn't have any other clothes to wear. The idea that I would prefer a Conservative government at any point to run this country is actually disgusting. It's offensive, and whoever said that is frankly it's disgraceful. They would even suggest such a thing. You know, I mean, the worst Labour government, the worst Labour government is always better than whatever the best Conservative government is. We have a hard right, populist, authoritarian government in power, which has presided over the deaths of 1 in every 1,000 people, according to excess deaths, during a deadly pandemic, which they catastrophically mishandled. Obviously, I will fight with every breath I have for a Labour government in any circumstances, which is why, as I've said, I supported the Labour Party when Tony Blair was leader, after he'd invaded Iraq and hundreds of thousands of people had died, including several British service personnel. And the only, I know, as it happens, I know some of the people who work for Keir Starmer very well, some of them nearly my entire adult life, others I know less well. But the ones who do know me in that Keir Starmer's leadership would know full well that the last thing I would ever want is any Labour leadership to fail. That doesn't mean I don't have my criticisms. Of course I criticised Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party, even though, politically speaking, the leadership then was closer to my politics than any time in my life. I criticise them, over the way they spoke about Black Lives Matter. I've criticised them because I think they should be stronger on how they deal with the pandemic. And I will keep saying they need to stick to the 10 pledges they made. But the idea that I would ever want a Conservative government which is wreaking absolute havoc in the lives of millions of people, including the people I grew up with, is just so grotesque. It's genuinely disgusting.
It comes across.
Owen, thank you. Owen, thank you for joining us. Owen has a book, This Land, The Story of a Movement. It goes through the fallout from the last general election, which was one of the worst in decades for the Labour Party. And Owen, like you mentioned in our chat, speaks to many of the people who were directly involved in that election campaign. Owen, thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
No worries. All right, cheers. I'll speak to you in a bit.